Today I'm going to talk just a little bit about one of the techniques that I rely on almost everywhere I go on the tournament trail, and that's called the Wacky Rig. It's a very simple concept, but I'm going to walk you through some of the specifics of how I fish it and why it works so well for me no matter where I fish. Just looking into the actual components of the Wacky Rig, it's a very simple concept, as I mentioned before. It's simply just a hook and your favorite straight tail. Typically you're going to use a straight tail soft plastic, and it's just simply hooked in the middle. And I use that term hooked in the middle very loosely, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But this is basically all it consists of right here. You can see I usually use just a small, like a drop shot hook. This particular hook by owner is actually designed for wacky rigging. This is just a Wacky Rig Hook with a little weed guard on it. You can see it right there. It has an actual weed guard, comes with the hook, and you just hook your favorite soft plastic. I use two. There's really only two soft plastics that I use everywhere I go, no matter if I'm using it with a weight or weightless. One is the Z-Man Finesse Worms, and I'm going to use it in the same color no matter what color the water is or anything. I really don't get too complicated with it. This particular color is called Dirt. It's basically two different shades of green pumpkin. It has more of a lighter green pumpkin belly, and then on the top it has it's sort of laminated with a darker green pumpkin. So I'll use that in the Zinkers, which is a little bit fatter one. The Zinkers doesn't sink quite as fast since it's a bulkier bait. And then when I want to get down a little deeper of the fish, or a little bit more spooky, a little bit more lethargic, then I'm going to use the Finesse Worms. And those are only two baits that I use when wacky rigging. You can use it weightless or with the weight. Nevertheless, even when you're using it weightless, your hook contributes somewhat to the weight. If you're going to use a larger hook, sometimes you can get just a little bit more subtle sink rate out of your bait by using a bigger or a smaller hook, whichever you desire. If you want to get that bait down a little deeper into the grass, the brush, or the structure that you're fishing, you can go with a little bit bigger hook and get that bait down. If it's a little windier, use just a tad bit bigger hook, and that's going to help you keep that bait down. And vice versa, when you want to go shallower, use a little bit smaller hook, and that'll keep that bait up in the water column a little bit. But a lot of times with the Zinkers, I'm going to use that one weightless, but if I want to fish that bait deep, 15-20 foot deep, like I'll often do, sometimes it takes a little bit of patience, I'll actually insert a nail weight. Back in the day, before we got really complicated with this, we just used a drywall screw or a finishing nail that we used to put in the head of the bait to help that bait get down in the water column. But over time, we started to use nail weights in the head of them, tungsten nail weights. They're a little bit smaller. They take up and occupy a lot less space in the actual bait themselves. So do that. You can change your sink rate by where you hook the bait in the middle as well. You can see you've got an egg sac here in the middle. You can always move that hook just a little bit farther towards the end, hook it a little bit more towards the end, and that's going to let that bait fall a little bit faster. What happens is that weight goes more towards the front of the bait, and it's going to dive down a lot quicker. A lot of times I just move the hook around to change the sink rate to get the bait down deeper, or if I want it shallower, I want it to stay in place a little bit better, sometimes I just keep it hooked in the middle. So one being the Z-Man Finesse Worms, the other being the Z-Man Sinkers. That works in just about every situation, from fishing it around bridge pilings, from throwing it to shallow grass like you see here in this particular video. And in this particular video, I'm using the Z-Man Finesse Worms. It's a little smaller profile. The grass is really shallow. Where I'm fishing is actually a tidal fishery, and when that tide gets low, the fish move to that edge of the grass, the very edge of the grass, right before it drops off in deep water, and they can be a little spooky. So using that little bit smaller soft plastic, something a little bit more subtle that stays in the strike zone a very long time, seems to work best in this situation. Now, one of the biggest questions that I'm always asked when you're talking about wacky rigging is actually, how do you work the bait? What do I need to do to it? And with the wacky rig, the less you work the bait, the better off you are. Most of the time when I cast that bait out, the first thing I do is feed it line. That way that bait where I cast it to, it stops immediately and it begins to just sink around whatever structure I've thrown it around. So if I'm fishing around a lay down, if I'm fishing around a dock, a grass line like you see here, I'm just going to throw that bait out to the edge of that grass line and just let it sink for the first 5 to 8 seconds. I'm not going to touch it. Usually after I've let it do that for a little while, I'll just check it. I'll engage my reel, check it to see if one's got it. A lot of times the bite occurs as soon as that bait hits the water and as it's sinking on the initial cast. So the first thing I'm going to do is engage the reel and check to see if anything's got it. I almost always use spinning equipment when using a wacky rig. This is a 7-foot rod, and I really prefer spinning equipment because I feel like you have more natural ability to impart action on the bait. It's just, you don't pull the bait near as far as you will with the bait caster. You got a much smoother drag. A lot of times we're going to use a smaller line, so a smooth drag system is important. When I'm working that bait back to the boat, I'm just going to just shake the worm and make that worm undulate. That's all I'm going to do. So when I shake the rod tip, that's just going to impart action on that bait, and it's just going to kind of undulate back to the boat. And it's an action that bass absolutely cannot stand, whether they're hungry and aggressive or they're more lethargic and really not in a feeding mode. A lot of times when that soft plastic coming by, just undulating right in their face, undulating, and stopping, it's really irritating to them, and a lot of times that draws a strike.
That's not a big one, but that fish, it's a little log right there on the water. You can't see it. Got me on the back side of that log, and thankfully 15-pound Seaguar braid. I got a little 8-pound test Tatsu leader. I got the job done. Otherwise I would have lost that. It's not a big fish, but I can't tell you how many times in tournaments I wish I would have had that one.
15-pound test smackdown braid. That is one of the most important parts of this particular setup. Oftentimes the bites are very, very light. They're just going to swim off with the bait, so having a very sensitive line is really important to detecting strikes. And using braided line, I feel anything and everything. It also allows me to penetrate that hook through the fish's mouth really well. A lot of times you're going to get a bite on a long cast. You need to be able to get that hook in the fish, and having that really, a line with no stretch in it really helps me drive that hook home. Oftentimes have a fluorocarbon leader. Almost always you're going to use a fluorocarbon leader. This is 8-pound test Tatsu, and it's very strong line, but when you're using light line, you don't really want to do a slack line whipping hook set. You notice a lot of times on my hook sets, it's really just a reel down and pull into them, just a long sweeping hook set. And having that braided line with no stretch, that allows me to drive that hook home without really putting on a lot of impact on my line and having line breakage issues. So these two components are absolutely imperative to have when you're out there finesse fishing, and most importantly when you're out there wacky rig fishing. I definitely suggest you guys 15-pound test, smackdown braid tied with a Alberto knot to fluorocarbon leader, preferably Tatsu or Invisex, anywhere from 8 to 12-pound test line. Wacky rig works in just about any situation you can think of out there. It's a great tactic to use to get those fish to bite that are a little less aggressive, but it's also a great tool to use when you're trying to fish in very shallow water as well as extremely deep water. That's one thing that's not noted for, but adding that little bit of nail weight to it and a little patience, you can really target those suspended fish they tend to spin over 20-25 foot of water, only 10 or 12 foot down. A wacky rig is a great way to target those fish. The biggest key when you guys are out there and you're fishing your wacky rig is patience. Don't overwork the bait. Learn to really take your time with your cast. Throw it to an object, let it sink. Don't do anything. Just let that bait sink. A lot of times as that bait sinking, that's when you're going to get your strikes. So be patient. Throw it around shallow targets, grass lines, docks, stumps, laydowns. Throw it around those targets, let it sink. If you don't get a bite, pick it up and move on to the second target. So it's actually a really good bait to cover water with once you learn the limitations and capabilities of the bait. Thanks for taking time to watch this video on wacky rig fishing. Make sure you guys check out some of my other videos, and I hope you'll come back for more.